I wasn't looking for love. At 52, I'd buried that dream beneath years of quiet routines and lonely nights. My life had become a series of predictable moments: grocery shopping on Thursdays, a cup of chamomile tea before bed, and a hollow kind of comfort in knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring. But then, out of nowhere, in the middle of a grocery store aisle, everything sh. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was standing there, debating whether to buy the same box of cereal I'd always bought. It's funny how these small decisions become the highlights of your week when you're alone. I felt a strange sensation then, like the air around me had changed, and he looked like he belonged anywhere but here. Tall, with a strong, broad frame, he wore a military jacket that clung to his shoulders in a way that made it clear he wasn't just passing through. His face was tanned, his hair cropped short, and his eyes, a sharp, piercing blue, locked onto mine with an intensity that made me catch my breath. He was young, much younger than me, but he smiled in a way that made age feel irrelevant. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice low and steady, carrying a hint of amusement. I realized I'd been staring and quickly looked down, fumbling with the box in my hands. "Oh, I'm just trying to decide if I should try something new," I said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. I hadn't felt like this in years, like a schoolgirl caught off guard by her own feelings. He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine, and picked up a different box. "Here," he said, holding it out to me. "This one's a good change. Trust me." I took it from him, our fingers brushing for the briefest moment. It was such a small, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of energy through me. I looked up, and for a second, everything else faded away: the bustling noise of the store, the mundane reality of my life. It was just him and me, standing there in that aisle, like we were the only two people in the world. "I'm Chris," he said, offering his hand, his smile widening. "Susan," I replied, taking his hand. It was firm, strong, but there was a softness in the way he held mine, a gentleness I hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't let go right away, and I found myself caught in the moment, staring up into his eyes. They were the kind of blue that made you think of the ocean, deep, endless, full of secrets. I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in decades. Desire, hope, a spark of possibility. "Do you come here often?" he asked, an easy grin spreading across his face. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Every Thursday, like clockwork," I admitted. "Well, Susan," he said, still holding my gaze, "maybe I'll see you here next week." It was such a simple statement, casual and light, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and watched as he gave me one last smile before turning and walking away, disappearing into the crowd of shoppers. I stood there for a moment, gripping the box of cereal he'd handed me, feeling my heart pound in my chest like I was 16 again. It was absurd, I told myself. I was too old for this, too set in my ways. But as I walked out of the store that day, the sunlight felt warmer, the air sweeter, and the world a little brighter. I knew it was just a chance meeting, a brief encounter. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that maybe my life wasn't as predictable as I'd thought. Maybe, just maybe, something new was beginning. I spent the entire week replaying our brief encounter in my mind, feeling ridiculous for how much it affected me. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, just a charming young man being friendly. But every time I thought of his smile, or the way his eyes held mine, a shiver of excitement ran through me. It was a feeling I hadn't allowed myself in so long, I'd almost forgotten what it was like. The next Thursday, I found myself at the store earlier than usual, lingering near the produce section, feeling like a foolish teenager. I picked up apples I didn't need, rearranged items in my cart, all the while scanning the aisles for any sign of him. And then, just as I started to give up hope, there he was. Chris appeared as if out of nowhere, looking just as handsome as I remembered. He wasn't in his military jacket this time, just a simple t-shirt that clung to his frame, highlighting his broad shoulders. He gave me that same warm, easy smile, and suddenly, the nerves that had been buzzing inside me all week melted away. "You again," he teased lightly, stopping in front of me. "I was starting to think I imagined you." I couldn't help but laugh. "I could say the same thing," I replied, feeling a blush creep up my neck. He reached for a bunch of bananas, examining them casually, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "You mind if I shop with you for a bit?" he asked, glancing over at me with a playful look in his eyes. "Not at all," I said, surprised at how easily the words came out. It felt good, refreshing, to say yes to something so simple yet so out of the ordinary for me. We wandered through the aisles together, and I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone in years. He told me about his life in the military, how he'd been stationed overseas, and the strange dissonance of coming back to a place that felt unchanged while he had experienced so much. He spoke with an honesty that disarmed me, and I found myself sharing bits of my own life, things I hadn't talked about in ages: my divorce, the empty nest once my kids moved out, the quiet loneliness that settled in like dust. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen. I hadn't realized how starved I was for that. Someone's undivided attention. Someone who looked at me like I mattered. "I get it," he said at one point, his voice softer, more serious. "It's strange how you can be surrounded by people and still feel alone." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yes," I whispered. "Exactly that." For a moment, we just stood there, the noise of the store fading into the background. It felt like the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only us in this bubble of connection. He reached out then, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my cheek. "I'm glad I ran into you again," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt something shift inside me, something profound and undeniable. "Me too," I managed to say, though the words felt small compared to the depth of what I was feeling. We continued shopping together, laughing and joking like we'd known each other for years. He insisted on carrying my bags to the car, and as we stood there, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow around us, he leaned in a little closer. "I'd like to see you outside of the store sometime," he said, his voice full of a hopeful sincerity that made my heart swell. I hesitated, a million thoughts racing through my mind: my age, our differences, the way people might look at us. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that this was a moment I'd regret if I let it slip away. "I'd like that too," I said, smiling up at him. He grinned, looking relieved, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something that wasn't just fleeting happiness. It was hope, pure and simple. Maybe life wasn't done surprising me yet. The days after our second meeting felt like a whirlwind. Chris and I exchanged numbers, and suddenly, my phone was filled with messages that made me smile in a way I hadn't in years. Every ping felt like a little spark, lighting up the empty corners of my life. We started texting every day. Silly jokes, stories about our day, and sometimes deeper conversations that left me lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about him. One evening, I found myself sitting on the couch, scrolling through our chat history with a glass of wine in hand. I couldn't help but laugh at one of his messages, a photo of him holding up 2 different ice cream pints, asking which one I'd choose. It was such a simple thing, but it felt so intimate, like he was inviting me into the small, everyday moments of his life. And then it hit me, like a wave crashing over me all at once. I wasn't just enjoying our conversations. I was falling for him. I set the wine glass down, my hands suddenly trembling. It was absurd. I was a woman in her 50s, divorced, with grown children and a life that had settled into a predictable rhythm. And here I was, developing feelings for a man who was at least 2 decades younger than me. I'd spent so many years convincing myself that love wasn't something I'd experience again, that those days were behind me. But Chris, he made me feel alive, like I was waking up from a long, cold winter. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the emotions swirling inside me. This wasn't just a crush. It was deeper than that. It was the way he made me laugh, the way he looked at me like I was the most important person in the room. It was the kindness in his eyes when he listened to me talk about my past, and the excitement in his voice when he shared his dreams for the future. It was everything I'd stopped believing I could have. But the fear was there too, creeping in at the edges of my joy. What if I was wrong? What if this was just a fleeting infatuation for him, a fun distraction, nothing more? I was old enough to know how these things could go, how easy it was to get swept up in the moment only to be left with nothing but regrets. I picked up my phone again, staring at his name on the screen. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I hesitated. Instead, I typed out a simple message. Can we meet tomorrow? I'd love to see you. His response came almost immediately. Absolutely. How about we go for a walk? There's a park near my place I think you'd like. I couldn't help but smile. He made everything sound so easy, so effortless. It was like he didn't see the complications I saw, didn't feel the weight of all the years between us. Maybe that was part of why I was falling for him. He made me feel like the woman I used to be before life had carved so many lines into my heart. I agreed to meet him, and as I set my phone down, a flutter of anticipation coursed through me. It was the kind of excitement I hadn't felt in decades, the kind that made you want to dance around the room. I allowed myself a moment of pure, unfiltered happiness, letting it wash over me. But as I headed to bed that night, the reality of it all settled back in. This was real. This was happening, and I had no idea where it would lead. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't turn back now. I was already in too deep that I barely slept the night before our walk. My mind was racing with thoughts of Chris, his smile, the way he made me feel so seen, so wanted. It had been a long time since I'd felt a connection like this, and with it came a fear that almost paralyzed me. What if I was misreading everything? What if he woke up one day and realized how ridiculous this was? By morning, I talked myself in and out of meeting him a dozen times. But when I saw his text, "I'm excited to see you," my heart leapt, and I knew I couldn't stay away. We met at a small park just a few blocks from his place. The trees were golden with the early signs of autumn, leaves crunching beneath our feet as we walked. He greeted me with that smile I'd come to crave, pulling me into a hug that lingered just a second longer than necessary. I breathed him in. He smelled like fresh pine and a hint of cologne, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I couldn't remember feeling for years. "How's your day going?" he asked, slipping his hand into mine as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I glanced down at our intertwined fingers, my heart skipping a beat. "It just got a lot better," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze, and we walked together in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of kids playing in the distance, the breeze rustling through the leaves. I'd forgotten how nice it could be to share these quiet moments with someone, to feel like part of a team again. We found a bench and sat down, and for a moment, I just watched him as he gazed out at the small pond, lost in thought. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, a woman with a life already half-lived, carrying the weight of every heartbreak and disappointment. And yet, when he turned back to me, there was no doubt, no hesitation in his eyes. Just affection. "You seem far away," he said, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "What's going on in that beautiful head of yours?" I bit my lip, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I'm just trying to understand why you're here with me. I mean, you could have anyone, and yet you're sitting here with a woman old enough to be your—" "Don't say it," he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. He leaned closer, his eyes searching mine. "Susan, I'm here because I want to be. You make me feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Something real." I felt tears welling up, and I turned away embarrassed. It's just hard for me to believe. I've spent so long convincing myself that this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. He reached out, cupping my chin and turning me to face him. "You deserve this. You deserve to be happy," he said softly, and before I could respond, he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, but as I melted into him, it deepened, igniting a fire I hadn't felt in years. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, forgetting everything but the way he felt against me. It was like coming alive again, like the years melted away, and I was just a woman kissing a man she wanted with every fiber of her being. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart racing. He rested his forehead against mine, smiling as if he'd just won a victory. "I've wanted to do that since the day I met you," he admitted, his voice husky. I laughed, a sound of pure joy that surprised even me. "Well, what took you so long?" He grinned, taking my hand in his again. "Maybe I was just waiting for you to catch up." We stayed there on that bench, holding each other as the sun dipped lower in the sky. For the first time in years, I didn't care about what anyone might think. It was just us, two people who'd found something unexpected and beautiful. And as we sat there, I realized that whatever fears I had, whatever doubts whispered in the back of my mind, I wasn't going to let them take this away from me. I'd spent too long being afraid of what might happen, and now I wanted to see where this could go. For once, I was ready to follow my heart. After our kiss at the park, something shifted between us. There was an unspoken understanding, a deepening of what had begun as simple flirtation. My days were suddenly filled with anticipation, my evenings spent thinking about him, replaying the moment our lips first met. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I hadn't felt this kind of urgency, this need to be close to someone, since I was a much younger woman. A few days later, Chris called me on a rainy Sunday afternoon. His voice was warm, familiar, and the sound of it washed over me like a balm. "Hey, I was thinking about you," he said. "I just picked up a bottle of wine. What do you say we crack it open together?" I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the decision I'd been circling around for days. It wasn't just about sharing a glass of wine. It was about inviting him into my space, into the life I'd carefully rebuilt for myself. It was about letting him see the cracks in the walls I'd put up over the years. But then I thought about the way he made me feel, lighter, more alive, like I could breathe easier when he was around. And I realized that I didn't want to be alone that night. I wanted him with me. "Come over," I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. "I'd love that." The silence on the other end of the line was brief, but I could almost hear his smile. "I'll be there in 20, he said softly. As I hung up the phone, I looked around my small living room, suddenly self-conscious. It was tidy, but it felt dated, filled with the remnants of a life I'd left behind. The photos of my kids, the antique clock I'd bought with my ex-husband years ago. I started to pick up a throw pillow, then dropped it, laughing at myself. What was I doing? This was Chris. He didn't care about any of that. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. My hair was loose, graying at the temples, but I didn't bother trying to hide it. I smoothed down my blouse, took a deep breath and waited. When he arrived, the rain had turned into a light drizzle, and his hair was damp, little droplets clinging to his eyelashes. He stepped inside, shaking off his jacket, and pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home. "You look beautiful," he whispered, kissing the top of my head. We made our way to the couch, the bottle of wine between us. I poured us each a glass, and we clinked them together with a soft, shared smile. It was easy with him, easier than anything had been in a long time. We talked for hours, the rain tapping softly against the windows, the wine warming us from the inside out. He told me about his time in college, his dreams of traveling, his family. I told him things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. How lonely it had been after my divorce, how I'd thrown myself into work to fill the void. How I'd given up on the idea of love, convinced it wasn't something meant for me anymore. He listened, his eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished, he took my hand in his. "You deserve so much more," he said quietly. "You deserve to feel loved, every single day." I looked down at our hands, my heart in my throat. It was the first time I truly let myself imagine what that might look like with him. The life I'd given up on suddenly felt possible again, but it also terrified me. It was one thing to enjoy the fantasy of it, but to actually step into this new reality meant risking everything. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Chris squeezed my hand, his eyes softening. "I am too," he said, "but I'm willing to take that risk if you are." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and he reached out, brushing it away with his thumb. The tenderness in that gesture broke something open inside me. I leaned in, pressing my forehead against his, feeling his breath mix with mine. "Stay," I whispered, the word hanging in the air between us. He pulled back just enough to look at me, searching my face for any hesitation. When he didn't find any, he nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm not going anywhere." The rain outside turned into a soft, steady rhythm as he kissed me, slow and sweet. It wasn't the hurried passion of our kiss at the park. It was deeper, like a promise. We held each other close, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I let myself believe that this could be real, that I could have this. The rest of the evening was a blur of laughter and whispered confessions, of stolen kisses and moments so tender they made my chest ache. We ended up tangled together on the couch, his head resting against my shoulder, our hands still clasped together. I'd never felt more content, more at peace, and as I drifted off to sleep, The last thing I heard was his soft, steady breathing, and the thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all these years. The days that followed felt like a dream, one I didn't want to wake up from. Chris and I fell into a rhythm, as if we'd been living in each other's lives for years, not just days. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of awkwardness, moments when I had to remind myself that this was real and not some fleeting fantasy. But every time I looked at him, saw the way he looked at me, all my doubts faded. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment I realized I could never go back to the life I had before. It was a Wednesday night, and we decided to have dinner at my place again. I'd made something simple, pasta and salad, but the evening had a sense of anticipation that I couldn't shake. Something was different this time, something I hadn't quite put my finger on until it was too late. We were sitting on the couch, finishing our glasses of wine, when he turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before. It was a quiet intensity, as if he was weighing something in his mind, something important. I could feel my heart start to race, that familiar knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. "Susan," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking about us. About this." I froze, my thoughts spiraling. Is this it? Is he about to tell me this was all just a fling? But then he reached out, cupping my cheek in his warm hand, his thumb brushing over my skin. The gesture felt so tender, so full of meaning, that the words didn't come out the way I expected. "I don't want to rush you," he said, his eyes searching mine. "But I need you to know that I'm in this. I'm not going anywhere, Susan. I want you. I want all of you." The room felt like it was closing in around me, but at the same time, my chest opened up, filled with a warmth that overwhelmed me. He wants me. He really wants me. I could barely breathe as his words sank in, the full weight of them hitting me harder than I expected. It wasn't just a passing fling, wasn't just about the connection we shared. He saw me, truly saw me, and he wanted me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice trembling. I wanted to tell him how badly I wanted this too, how my heart had already claimed him, but the words seemed inadequate. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, leaning in slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I met him halfway, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that felt like it carried everything we hadn't said yet. As he deepened the kiss, I felt my body respond instinctively, the tension and uncertainty of the past few days melting away in an instant. It was as if every part of me, every cell in my body, had been waiting for this moment. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm scared too," I admitted softly, my forehead resting against his. "But I'm not afraid of you, Chris. I'm afraid of what this means." He smiled, his thumb brushing along my cheek again. "It means we're ready for whatever comes next. Together." I let out a shaky breath, letting his words sink in. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was truly living. Not just existing. Not just going through the motions of a life that had become safe, predictable. No, this was something entirely different. It was messy, and it was raw, but it was real. And that night, as we held each other close, I made a promise to myself that I would not let fear stop me from experiencing this love. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we would face, I would embrace it all with an open heart. Because for the first time in so long, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. With Chris by my side, I knew I could face anything. The next morning, I woke up next to him, the soft rhythm of his breathing in sync with my own. I had never felt more certain of anything in my life. This was just the beginning, and I was ready to see where it would take us. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, and undeniable connection. I couldn't get enough of Chris. His presence in my life felt like a breath of fresh air, a new chapter unfolding in a book I thought I'd already read to its last page. There were nights when we stayed up talking for hours, sharing pieces of ourselves that we hadn't shared with anyone else. There were mornings when I woke up and found his arms wrapped around me, the weight of them comforting, reassuring me that I wasn't alone anymore. But with all the closeness, there was also an undercurrent of fear. I couldn't shake the worry that maybe this was too much too fast, that our age difference might be more than just a number, that it would eventually get in the way of everything we had. Chris was young, full of energy and ambitious. He had his whole life ahead of him, I couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere down the line, he would wake up and realize he could do better than me. One night, after a quiet dinner at my place, we were curled up on the couch, the dim light of a lamp casting shadows over us. His fingers traced lazy patterns on my arm, and I could feel his gaze on me, steady, unwavering. "Chris," I started, my voice shaking with vulnerability, "are you sure about this? About me? I know we've talked about it, but sometimes I wonder if I'm holding you back." He stopped tracing patterns and turned to face me fully, his expression serious but gentle. His hand cupped my cheek, his thumb grazing the soft skin there, as though he were memorizing every detail of me. "Susan," he said softly, "I'm more sure about you than anything I've ever been sure about. I don't care about the years between us. I care about you. I care about us." A wave of emotion washed over me, relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For so long, I had convinced myself that love wasn't meant for me anymore, that I had missed my chance. But here he was, offering me something I thought was out of reach, something real and tangible. "I'm scared, too," I confessed, my voice breaking. "Scared that it's not enough, that people won't understand, that this might be too much for us to handle." Chris smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that made my heart flutter. "I don't care what anyone thinks. What matters is how we feel about each other. And I know how I feel. I'm in this, Susan. And I want you to be, too." His words, simple but filled with so much meaning, calmed the storm of fear inside me. I leaned in and kissed him, slow and tender, as though we were sealing our promise to each other in that moment. When we pulled apart, I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my ear. For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that this could work. That love, real, messy, complicated love, could be mine again. And I wanted it with him. I wanted this future, whatever it looked like, and I wanted to build it with Chris by my side. The next weekend, Chris suggested we go away for a couple of days, just the two of us. "Let's get out of here," he said. "Go somewhere new, somewhere we can just be us." We ended up at a small cabin by the lake, nestled in the woods. It was peaceful there, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. We spent the days hiking, cooking meals together, and talking about everything and nothing. At night, we sat by the fire, our legs tangled together, sharing stories and dreams. On our second night, as we watched the stars twinkle above us, I turned to Chris, feeling the weight of everything I was about to say. "I'm not scared anymore," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I'm not afraid of us." Chris smiled, his eyes bright with warmth. "Me neither." And in that moment I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. There was no turning back now. Our bond had been solidified, not by the words we spoke, but by the quiet moments in between, the touch of his hand, the way we fit together as if we'd always been meant to be. The days that followed felt surreal, as though I were living in a dream that I was afraid to wake up from. Chris and I had settled into a rhythm, and it was a rhythm I hadn't known I was capable of. Each morning, I woke up beside him, his arms wrapped around me, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. There were no more doubts, no more fears that I wasn't enough. With Chris, I was exactly who I was meant to be. We faced our challenges, of course. No relationship is without its hurdles, and the world outside of our little bubble still had its judgments. Friends, family, people we barely knew, they all had their opinions about our relationship. Some said we were too different, that age was a barrier we couldn't overcome. Others were simply baffled, unsure of how to fit us into their neat little boxes. But none of that mattered. What mattered was how we made each other feel. One evening, as we sat on the porch of my house, watching the sunset together, I reflected on how far we had come. The fear that had once consumed me was gone, replaced with a deep sense of gratitude and acceptance. I had never thought love could come to me again, not in the way it had when I was young, not with this intensity. But here I was in my 50s, finding a love that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced before. "I used to think love had a timeline," I said quietly, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "That it was something that happened when you were younger, when you had time to grow old with someone. But now I see that love doesn't care about the years. It doesn't care about age. It just happens when it's meant to. Chris turned to me, his eyes full of admiration and tenderness. You're right. I'm not in this because of the number of years we've lived, Susan. I'm in this because of who you are, and I've never felt more alive than I do when I'm with you. I smiled, my heart full. The world around us may have had its expectations, but we had found something deeper, something that was ours alone. Our love was a story written in moments of quiet understanding, laughter, and trust, a love built not on the idea of perfection, but on the raw, beautiful reality of two people choosing each other every day. As time went on, I found myself thinking more and more about the future. The future wasn't about what we had left behind or what others thought of us. It was about the life we were creating together. I knew there would be obstacles. I knew that people would still talk, that there would be days when we'd feel the weight of their opinions. But in the end, none of that mattered. The love we had was stronger than anything the world could throw at us. I learned that love is not bound by time. It's not about how many years you've lived or how many years you have left. It's about the moments you share, the way someone makes you feel when they look at you, the quiet promises made without words. And so I held on to this love, this unexpected, beautiful love, knowing that, no matter what came our way, we would face it together. Because when you find something as rare and precious as what we had, you don't let go. You embrace it fully, with an open heart, ready for whatever life may bring.